The session today is called At the Crossroads, which is intended to raise questions pertaining to art in culture, and specifically artist-constructed environments. Artist-constructed environments in cultures as cultural statements. And one of the central questions is, whose culture? The announcement to the session announces that our field has been too long riven by oppositions between the supposed mainstream, mainframe culture and those cultural productions of people who create outside or independent from that framework, but also speak of culture nonetheless. And again, we say, whose culture are they speaking? Who speaks for our culture? Our approaches suggest that artists construct simultaneously from within specific cultural contexts and for our culture simultaneously. So we take it for granted that what we're talking about is art. Art as a basic human behavior. Art manifests in many forms, across many sectors, across many aspects of our culture. It's a wide open field today, a wide open field of inquiry, of research, of discovery. It's important for all of us, the three speakers and us, to recognize just where we plant our markers, where we plant our flags within this wide open field. What are the issues that we address? What are the aspects of culture as visual behavior that we seek to try to understand and illuminate? And so the three of us take very different approaches to these issues. Jo Farb Hernandez, who will be speaking first, is a professor of art and art history at San Jose University, and she's director of that wonderful organization, Spaces. She's an authority. She's written, an author who's written many books and catalogs, most notably and most recently, the groundbreaking presentation and analysis of the artist-constructed environments across Spain, Singular Spaces. It is an essential book. It's a groundbreaking, breathtaking book. It's essential reading for anyone who wants to know about the breadth of creation about which very few people have known. But it's also a major contribution to all studies of artist environments. Randall Morris, our second speaker, has been for decades a leading voice in broadening our knowledge of the vital cultural production from Africa, from Asia, from the Caribbean, from North America. He's co-director of Kevin Morris Gallery. But I think he's probably one of the most impassioned and challenging writers about the historical development, the historical roots, the transmission of culture, and its constant development as an art that speaks to cultural creativity. My work as a retired professor of literature is going to be about comments about environments as an art form, as a way of manipulating space, as a terrain for visual action and visual meaning, as a way of becoming personal and at the same time speaking of the cultural. But we'll go right on to Jo.
My encyclopedic book on monumental art environments created by Spanish self-taught artists documented the work of 45 artists through almost 1,200 pages of text and over 5,000 photographs. At the time I began this project in 2000, anecdotal evidence or local newspaper stories were my only sources for determining the whereabouts or even the existence of Spain's monumental site-specific works of art. Yet while my intent had been to produce a complete compendium based on 14 years of fieldwork, discovery of new sites in the 3.5 years since publication made me realize that further fieldwork, analysis, and the writing of a second volume would be essential to realize a fully encyclopedic treatment of these amazing sites. Taking advantage of my position as director of Cal State's international program during 2015-16, I was able to begin preliminary fieldwork across Spain, and I'm now working on volume 2. Spain is a big and diverse country, and its art environments, like those the world over, display a wide range of forms, of scale, and media. They include monumental architectural structures, groupings of monumental numbers of sculptures, park-like grottos, decorated interiors or exteriors, personal shrines or museums, and assemblages of found or of natural or of created objects. So in thinking about how to frame this presentation, I considered options such as a concentration on new architectural construction, or on female creator builders, or a geographic slice through the country moving north to south. But I decided to concentrate on Spain's southernmost region of Andalusia, as my CSU work in Granada gave me opportunity to learn about and explore many more sites in that region. Despite great beauty and an illustrious cultural history, Andalusia is one of the poorest regions of Spain. Century after century, its citizens were innocent pawns in high-level deals played out by church and state, paying no heed to the resulting long-term economic and cultural damages. In the 15th century, their lands were confiscated to pay off nobles who had financed the reconquest of the peninsula from its Muslim rulers. In the 16th and 17th centuries, their men were conscripted to support Spain's overseas mercantile adventures, with all the riches later diverted to serve as Habsburg wards and line the pockets of the nobility. And more recently, their sons were drafted into Franco's nationalist army during the Spanish Civil War, despite a regional sympathy for the other side. With little local industry, over 1.5 million Andaluses immigrated during the post-Civil War and World War II decades. Even today, unemployment is still higher in this region than in any other part of Spain. It is therefore not surprising that Andaluses adopted a strategy of adapting what was available to address what was needed. Sometimes materials were recycled in unusual ways, taking on new functions. Although such materials might include discards or natural materials free for the taking, the methods and manners of this usage were typically clever and even ingenious, as well as often aesthetically striking. In today's presentation, I will introduce 4 very different Andaluz artists who I've just met within the last 1.5 years, who may perhaps be seen as representative of this region and this country. Juan Muñoz Benitez was the 3rd child born into a baker's large family in the small village of Dilar, physically located only 5.5 miles from the city of Granada, although a world away in time and amenities. After leaving school at age 14, Juan toiled in the fields of local landowners in order to earn a meager living. In 1954, he and his young wife moved into the simple 2-story home in which they lived until their deaths, and he enjoyed working around and improving the house. Around 1975, he decided to install a fountain in the open space that separated the house from the road, but he couldn't find one that he liked or could afford, so he decided to make one himself. Relying on his prior experience doing small household repairs with a Portland cement and sand mortar, and utilizing simple standard construction tools such as trowels, levels, and cords, he improvisationally outlined the shape of the fountain in the concrete with his finger. Afterward, he ornamented it with small cast figures and pebbles. He traveled to the coast to gather the pebbles and borrowed a doll from his niece to make the molds. Muñoz's ever-improving skills enabled him to become ever more daring with his designs. Also on the front lawn is a circular table ornamented with a monumental butterfly with outstretched wings, surrounded by 5 fixed concrete stools with butterfly backrests. Working without sketches or plans, his designs make clear references to the visual imagery of Granada, renowned for decorated pavements and patios in which often extravagant fluid lines and abstracted organic forms are interspersed with more geometric patterns. As the numbers and scale of his work increased, including freestanding sculptures of birds and other creatures, Muñoz installed a front fence to protect the work. Sinking steel rods and pipes along the road frontage, he covered the metal infrastructure with concrete mortar, later ornamenting the variously shaped columns and posts with elaborate black and white pebble designs. The decoration is balanced and proportional, but each upright is not identical, enabling the artist to seek symmetry through variable elements to enhance the potency of the visual impact. These elegant columns and markers would be significant on their own, but a large portal leading to the home's front door surges beyond simple decoration. Reflecting the prevailing iconography of the flamenco culture, the left gate post supports a monumental brimmed hat, and the right supports a monumental guitar. While these musical references are obvious, less so are the elongated necks and ferocious heads of 2 lion-like creatures, each bursting out of the top of the lateral gate posts. They are sophisticated and finely sculpted, their heads twisting contrapuntally away from their bodies. Once Munoz discovered the possibilities inherent in working with the pebbles, he did little else, and the initial skepticism of family and neighbors evolved into admiration. Likewise, although the village authorities never supported him, neither did they impede his work. And as both his proficiency with his materials and his fame spread, he enjoyed not only the creative expression of the work, but his increasing identification as an inventive and ingenious craftsman. The word artist was never used. While the portal of the front perimeter fence of his property is wildly showy, it was in a rear interior patio, not visible from the street, that Munoz realized his most extravagant and ornate efforts. An arched entrance is flanked by bas-relief figures, a bearded male on one side, a female with necklace and rather elaborate hairstyle on the other. Every wall is completely covered with elaborate decorations, an aesthetic feat on its own, but made more difficult due to the propensity of the small stones to fall when inserted vertically. One wall features imagery combining fantastic beasts with Baroque-style urns, fluid lines, and floral forms. Another is entirely geometric, with an almost Art Deco stylization. A centrally located table surrounded by 8 fixed stools, each with different vertical ornamentation as well as distinct imagery on the seating surface, features 2 Greek-like figures standing on either side of a similarly scaled double-headed eagle found not only in Greek, Roman, and Byzantine periods, but also in medieval Spain. Its central post is echoed by a series of 3 columns that serve as a visual screen for a smaller room extending off from the open patio. This room is also completely sheathed in black and white pebble designs and includes bas-relief columns supporting arched lintel-like forms, mimicking the Islamic architectural treatment so well represented in this part of Spain. An elaborate 3/4 bust of a 12-point buck graces a side wall. The interior of Munoz's home is also wildly and idiosyncratically ornamented. The room leading from the outdoor patio is dominated by a huge polished and elaborately carved trunk of an olive tree that reaches from floor to ceiling. Pebble wainscoting adorns the bottom sections of all walls, while plaques, some of significant size and partially bas-relief, decorate the upper areas. Even the staircase leading to the second floor is fully ornamented, both on the stair risers and on its surrounding walls. Munoz continued working on both freestanding sculptures as well as integrated architectural features until shortly before he died at age 74. The site, not open to the public and largely unknown, is a stunning example of how an internalized sense of regional imagery can evolve into something unique and daring. And while the best of his work is hidden from public view, mirroring the rather introverted form of the typical Islamic-style house in southern Spain, with its greater concern for the creation and ornamentation of open interior spaces rather than for its public face, the perimeter fence does tease with the promise of what lies within. Juan Munoz Benitez, whose vocation left him little room for creativity, found his own outlet by midlife to honor the architecture, ornamentation, flora, and fauna of his region, as he likewise sculpted his own personal path towards distinctive artistry and original expression. Born in northern Holland, Freddy Zuidek moved with his family as they followed his father's service in the diplomatic corps. By age 19, he'd landed in London following a girlfriend who would later become his wife. Although he had wanted to study architecture in America, he changed his focus to be with her, and instead earned a degree in economics. These studies, no doubt, helped him to become a successful businessman and restaurateur, but he ultimately cashed out of his London businesses and apartment and moved to Spain in 1990. Using the sale proceeds, he bought a small house on a 2/3 acre plot in the mountains overlooking the village of Nerja on Spain's Costa del Sol. But he became involved in new businesses down in town. Again, they were successful. And although his plan was to fix up the house, between his then dubious construction skills, distractions from his town businesses, and, frankly, too much partying, he only worked on the house periodically, leaving it open to the elements when he was away, so much of the early work needed to be ripped out and redone. Around 2005, Freddy moved permanently up to the hill and began to devote all his time and energy to transforming the tiny 3-room cabin. He was attracted to the rocky landscape and wanted to incorporate some of the natural elements into his work. So he knocked out walls and made the low rocks part of the interior footprint of his construction rather than leaving them outside. He added trencadís designs and also, to an ever-increasing extent, carved plaster elements, changing the shape of walls, ceilings, and rooms. A friend who was a master plasterer showed him the basics, and Freddy has now become an unofficial master himself. He wraps an infrastructure of metal rods with chicken wire to form his desired shape, and then piles on the plaster. These decorative elements are all solid, so as to avoid interior cavities into which rodents might crawl and nest. When he realized that the weight might tax the foundation of the house, he reinforced it rather than change the manner in which he works. The house is a work in progress, but it already shows remarkable ingenuity and an increasing refinement. While the lines of the house itself are rectilinear, his ornamentations are all organic, with undulating shapes and contoured edges. There is constant flow between interior and exterior, with numerous welcoming areas for sitting and relaxing. He has learned to be as precise as possible in the early stages of his plasterwork, and then, after letting these structures dry for 2 or 3 days, he returns to carve them, adding to their intricacy. During my visit, he was modifying the lower level of the structure, which had once been a chicken coop, adding bedrooms, bathrooms, and comfortable seating areas. Having already paid a fine for terracing his garden areas and building without a permit, Freddie is fearful of again drawing the attention of the authorities. So he no longer picks up stones and found objects for the beach, for example, thinking that if the police were to see him gathering the materials, they would know that he was going to use them in construction. And while the regional government is willing to legalize illegal structures, the cost of requesting a permit and then having all the work done by a licensed contractor rather than allowing him to give free rein to his own creativity is just too much for him to contemplate. So he continues to build furtively, consumed and energized by the work he is doing, yet fearful of attracting unwanted attention. Born into a family of farmers, Maria Rodriguez grew up near the Mediterranean Sea in Almeria province. She had little schooling, mostly spending her youth looking after her younger sister while her parents worked in the fields. She married a local farmer, and afterward the young couple moved into a beachfront home earlier owned by her father. They worked hard to refurbish it and appointed it in the style of the last century, dark carved wood furniture, doilies, and vintage chandeliers. Her married life followed a typical pattern. She cared for her 3 sons and her husband, kept the house, and did the shopping and cooking. But she had always harbored the idea of creating something through which she could express herself. So she turned over ideas in her mind as she raised her boys and kept house. Finally, after they were grown, in the mid-1980s, she began to build her garden. She never drew plans, but she envisioned the completed objects in her mind, so she began assembling the stones and shells and found objects that she gathered from the beach, building up a fence in front, and then filling in from that border to the very steps of the patio of her home. A narrow pathway leads from her front door through the garden directly to the beach itself. As she remembered watching her father build when she was young, she knew that she needed to make a mortar of cement and sand, with more of the former and less of the latter. She mixed small batches in a bucket and then climbed a stepladder, her apron pockets full of stones and ornaments, and her 2 hands cupping the mortar paste. After the first base level of stones, she would add more ornaments and shells, enhancing the complexity and density of the site. Despite this balancing act, she never fell. She sandwiched her labors between shopping and cooking for her family. Little by little, her garden grew more and more dense as it also grew higher. She called the more vertical components that anchor different corners of the garden her trees. And on the perimeters are places to sit, something impossible on the interior of the garden areas because they are compacted so tightly that it is impossible to enter them without stepping on or jumping over the sculptures. Not recommended. A variety of carefully painted signs, many with proverbs or well-known phrases, underscore her principles and her secularized spirituality. Although her work was right on the beach, people respected it, and she had few problems either from passers-by or from municipal or coastal regulators. There is little tourism here, with most visitors heading east beyond the Maria or west towards Malaga and Marbella, so there has been little, if any, theft. Maria died 2 nights ago, secure in the knowledge that her garden would endure forever, although her children were never so sure. Neither they nor her 5 grandchildren ever helped her place any work, although if she asked, family members or friends would help her drag large stones or boulders into place, sometimes securing them with a cord or chain and dragging them with their cars. It's unclear how much effort they will expend to maintain it now that she has passed. Maria Rodriguez never considered herself to be an artist, nor did she consider her work to be sculpture. But she was delighted when people appreciated what she did, and it is clear that their interest helped to inspire her to create until she could work no longer. Benalmádena on Spain's southern Costa del Sol, otherwise a typical tourist town, boasts an astounding monument, the Colomares Castle, constructed by Esteban Martín and 2 local bricklayers to honor Christopher Columbus and the discovery of America. Almost improbably built over the short 7-year period between 1987 and 1994, this 5-story castle combines elements that represent all of the architectural styles extant in Spain during the time of Columbus's life: Mudéjar, Romanesque, Gothic, and Byzantine. Martín studied medicine and then moved to the United States, where he worked for many years as a gynecologist and a surgeon. While there, he was astounded that the annual Columbus Day activities, featuring Italian parades and festivities, never mentioned the role Spain played in providing financial and personnel resources to Columbus in support of his voyages. Having been educated during the years of Franco's dictatorship, when patriotism was so highly valued, Martín felt that Spain was being unfairly left out of the narrative. In the 1970s, he purchased a plot of land in the hills above Benalmádena with the intent of one day building a simple retirement home. However, he became obsessed with the injustice he saw in the American celebrations of Columbus's discoveries and resolved to construct a monument that would clarify in great detail the story of these world-changing events. He diligently studied every book and document he could then access in order to certify the historical veracity of his work, and hoped that one day his quote-unquote book in stone would become a center for historical research on this theme. The castillo includes many elements referential to Spain's Fernando and Isabel, the kings who financed Columbus's voyage and unified Spain's disparate kingdoms, as well as details pertaining to the 3 main religions of Spain: Catholicism, Islam, and Judaism. Other more surprising elements include a Chinese-style pagoda built on a Mudéjar-style base, symbolizing Columbus's efforts to reach Asia for its spices and riches. Particularly notable are anchors representing the port, Palos de la Frontera, from which Columbus sailed, and the depictions of his 3 boats, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, this latter set apart as it had run aground and did not complete the voyage. The castle is surrounded by gravel paths and landscape gardens, elements added by the family after Dr. Martín's death. With a floor plan of over 16,000 square feet and towers that rise to 100 feet, Colomares is the largest monument in the world dedicated to Christopher Columbus. Yet it also houses the smallest chapel, only 21 square feet. Martín hoped that one day it would become the final resting place for Columbus's ashes, the whereabouts of which are unknown. Martín had great plans to add to the site, but by 1994, having run out of money and depressed that his castillo had not received more publicity or was not included as a resource for the widespread 1992 observances of the 500th anniversary of Columbus's first voyage, he gave up, and he died a few years later, disheartened and dispirited. Now operated by Martín's widow and family, they have plans of their own to enhance the site through more activities, providing much-needed funds for maintenance and conservation of the monument. These widely divergent artists, diverse in age, in the differences in their urban versus rural milieu, in their knowledge of a wider world, as well as, of course, in their aesthetic, their choice of medium and technique, and their intent, are only a microcosm of the art environments found throughout Andalusia, and indeed around Spain as a whole. Yet they may be seen as representative markers of the field. And while all are still privately held either by the artist or his or her heirs, 2 of these 4 nevertheless face existential pressures. Freddie's from the local government, wary that his improvements might somehow threaten local tourism. Maria's due to her children's ambivalence about their mother's work and their refusal to commit to efforts to preserve it. Although the community of Dilar is generally supportive of Juan Muñoz's decorations, and the heirs of Colomares are careful in the attention they pay to abiding by local laws and regulations, in none of these cases does a community of activists exist who would leap to defend these sites should the need arise. What this means for us is that our appreciation and documentation of these sites cannot stand alone without advocacy and political action, often over the long term. In each of our own regions, not only in Spain, we need to be vigilant, ready to spearhead a campaign if necessary, so that we can ensure that future generations will have the pleasures that we have had of experiencing these sites in situ and of learning from what these artists wanted to share with us. And each small success, one by one, indicates positive progress toward greater inclusivity in art historical definition as we break down the boundaries between art historical genres, genres that themselves often break down in the face of creative expressions on the ground, as it brings us closer to a more comprehensive and authentic understanding of what making art can be. Thank you.
First, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Kohler. But I have to jump right in. My talk takes two ideas and merges them. One being that yard shows or spirit yards are a connected link between the US and Caribbean, and the other being that we can best understand them by perceiving three generations of artists in context. Those born in the 19th century, those born between 1900 and 1950, and those born post-1950, and how an earlier African, then African-American religion that later became called conjure or hoodoo affected them all. I find that the yard complex in the US, Haiti, and Jamaica all demonstrate and remember a relationship with an African morality of balance become American, reborn and reshaped out of necessity, creating a new religion on this continent. The spirit yard is the root for most African-American vernacular art. Not very often documented in our field, art historically, is the overwhelming evidence that our field of art brut or non-mainstream needs to expand its language of context and intention in regards to African-American vernacular art. We need to put it back in the context it never really left, a language of change and survival by a once free, then enslaved, then freed and persecuted, deeply complex culture of people who struggle to this day for equality and dignity. This struggle is what the art chronicles. The problem of such a big subject in an 18-minute lecture is that I can't possibly give you the groundwork leading to the conclusions. So I'm going to express quickly these premises and then show you some images that illustrate them. Ultimately, it's about what land and place mean to people, and that's why we're bonded to it at this conference. When the slaves were brought here, they came from an essential religion based on balance in the world. There were moral precepts and a cycle of life they existed within for hundreds of years or longer. This essential concept didn't die in the Middle Passage. And on this continent, North, South, and Central America, it became a religion, a real religion, not a slave religion, but a religion rebuilt and practiced by the slaves. It was the parent concept of conjure and hoodoo, but those are secular practices informed by spirituality. And this was the matrix religion itself that disappeared shortly after slavery. I'm not sure that it was ever given a name. You'll find that a lot of the art and a lot of the slides, abstractly and conceptually, come from this diagram, which goes from birth, then living one's life, then dying, then going beneath the waters and meeting the ancestors. And by meeting the ancestors, one would become reborn. It was that cycle that was interrupted by slavery. This is just a casual shot from northern Florida where you can see that those same patterns echoed. These are the African root forms. These were the ones, these are what people call them Africanisms, but these were sort of the roots that the African religion was based on. The first one is still danced in the US and Jamaica and is an abstract movement in Haiti. We call it the ring shout now, and it's still danced in revival ceremonies in Jamaica. The second one is, we see this manifested in Pentecostal and spiritual churches, and of course in Haiti and Jamaica. The third one we see in different degrees in all the diaspora cultures, from conceptual sacrifices to actual animals. The fourth one, conjure and hoodoo, now use cards and other forms of divination. In Jamaica, it's cards, and in Haiti, it's cards. In Cuba, it's shells in the Yoruba fashion. The fifth one is yard shows and artworks constantly venerate charismatic beings. The sixth one, sickness comes from either bad behavior, witchcraft, or moral weakness. Again, an upsetting of the balance that was laid out in the previous slide. And seven, of course, all the cultures use plants to heal. The second thing that's important to this is in my research, I saw that if I divided when certain artists lived and across the Americas and divided them by generation, I saw major shifts in the formal qualities and intentionality of the art over time. Much of it in response to the cultural matrix of African Atlantic existence and the Western reactions to it, such as Jim Crow. The religion also changed and shifted after slavery, desacralizing, becoming more local and individualized in a new life as conjure and hoodoo. The first generation would be those born in the 19th century. The second generation would be those born before 1950. The third would be those born afterwards. The concerns of the first generation were mostly those found in the spirit yard and directly informed by the old religion, ancestors, remembrance, and protection. The second generation was more affected by the social movements around it and the world wars and how Black life was affected by them, with the church on one side and the blues on the other, figuratively speaking. So there was a shift from Africanisms to church or hoodoo in the spirituality. The third generation reflects all of the above with a contemporary focus on survival of memory and self-empowerment, wisdom, as well as religion. The third premise, and what makes it relevant to this conference mostly, is that I see the spirit yards, as I call them, in all their many shapes and forms as the language of this religion and a continuance throughout time moving along the path of the cosmogram. Big and small yards speak the same language. Some are quiet and personal, some are overt. Racism drove both the spiritual and social worlds of Black people throughout this hemisphere. The yard, the laku, the home ground, provided the space to talk about it and resist. Not an Africanism, mind you. This was an American hybrid religion pieced together out of necessity. This shows what it became in the Americas and what's reflected in the America. By amuletic, on the second one, I mean protection, didactic, being storytelling, healing, manifestation of the self, control or manipulation of local place, and recycling the overculture, which is meaning using materials cast off and given one meaning in one culture and a completely different meaning in the other. We often read that the yard show is a carryover of the Congo Cemetery complex. Scholars like Wayne McGaffey, Greg Gundiker, Judy McWillie, and Robert Ferris Thompson have spent decades filling in the gaps in yard show language. Africanist and art historian Dana Rush has put forth two ideas that dovetail right into this discussion. One is her theory of what she calls an unfinished aesthetic. Another is what she calls the transatlantic shrine, a conceptual African-influenced shrine which has come across the waters in the form of altars throughout the Americas that piece together local materials alluding to African spiritual forces. These range from indoor installations to the use of landscape. The embellished and highly metaphoric front and backyard seen all through the South and the Caribbean are perfect examples of these transatlantic shrines. They revere the ancestors, protect the house and family. Rush refers to unfinished aesthetic as a way to describe the idea that a shrine or a sculpture is constantly renewed with other accumulative offerings. It's not about the finished piece, but instead about the process of its life, added to and changed over time, constantly changing the work as it moves through space. An African, and by extension a diaspora work of art, is never finished, but is always in process. I apply this directly in suggesting the yard show throughout the hemisphere is a form of both transatlantic shrine and an example of the aesthetic of the unfinished. It is a language we must learn to speak in order to translate the art so we can understand why it was made and, most importantly, who it was made for. Before I show more images, I just want to say that I believe that all Black Atlantic art from this continent springs from not only this old religion, but from what it became and still is in hoodoo and conjure in the U.S., voodoo in Haiti, Santeria and Palo Mayombe in Cuba, Obia, Kumina, and revival in Jamaica, and on and on. The Protestant ethic of the U.S. was the most restrictive, so its old religion manifestations are the most abstracted. Jamaica is somewhere in the middle, and Haiti and Cuba have Catholicism rather than Protestantism, and so have kept not African, but most of the slaves and their descendants' religion in its original forms. It's time for our field to tie the art to the culture again in order to understand the work we're continuing to cherish so greatly. This is a cross that actually in a cemetery in Croix des Bouquets in Haiti by Georges Liautaud. And they're all gone now. They were all ripped off and are in private collections around the world because there was just no protection for them in Haiti. But in it, you can see the arms of the cosmogram, and people would think, oh, these are just these Catholic crosses, but here's a bunch of them that he made. And he was a very smart man. They're playing on the French forms and French architectural forms, but they also have all these different meanings, each one relating to a different Haitian Loire spirit. And each of them it's like he took those Haitian drawings up off the floor and raised them up into the form of crosses and three-dimensionalized them. I have this slide in here to show an example of a quiet or personal yard show. And in it, you can see that a lot of the things that I talked about there before are there. Remembrance, relatives of his father, I think it was, wasn't it, John? It was his father had given him some of the objects. So it's remembrance of ancestors. It's didacticism because he liked to sit there and tell you about what was going on in the yard. Manifestations of self in the way that they're arranged and put out. Control and manipulation of local place. And recycling the culture because these are all objects that have one meaning in one culture and then given a new meaning in the next. These American yards you mostly know, so I'm just going to sort of dance through them, but this is, I always saw Edmondson's yard as a yard show, and I don't know that I've ever seen it spoken of such. It's always been the place where people said he sold his pieces, but I think there's a lot more going on. I think it's pretty significant that he's leaning against, in all the books you see that written as the Ark, as Noah's Ark, and I don't think it's that at all. I think it's the Ark of the Covenant, and it's sitting on this unfinished foundation, just like in the Bible. And he obviously felt it was an important place to pose for the photograph. This is another view of his yard. I don't think any of that is random. Sam Doyle, again, you see all those things going on: history, storytelling, manifestation of self, ancestors. I think this is the newest incarnation. The slide was seen earlier today. I see you can have indoor yard shows. There is some place where that's, to me, very much what this was, straddling old and new religion, recycling materials of the Oberkultur in order to make a point for a different culture. J.B. Murray, his yard actually, was small, and he did have some accumulations of materials, but what he did was indoors protect himself and build an amuletic arrangement around where he worked and made his drawings, which were in a sort of a language from God. This was his outdoor one. Mary T. Smith, we all know. David Butler. Joe Minter. Haiti, it has a different look, and I said in there the sort of the religion manifests differently yet the same. There was a lot more about you're so used to seeing, because of flags and commercial stuff, Haitian iconography but we have to remember that it was made up. There was no way that these Loa, these Haitian gods, were supposed to look. So this is a painting from the 30s. These two paintings almost affected our field very directly. They're two of the paintings that André Breton bought from Hippolyte in Haiti in the 1940s, and he brought them back, and they became part of Dubuffet's collection, but Breton took them back, and they would have been the first and maybe the beginning of other African-American entries into the collection. But Breton didn't want them to go back to the US with the rest of the collection and sort of be stored in someone's house. And he took them back, and sort of the African-American relationship to the Art Brut collection got taken, but you can see that they have a wall style because Hippolyte used to paint the walls of Haitian voodoo temples. This is a voodoo temple, and there you have an abstraction of that cosmogram again. You have the center pole, or the potomitan as it's called, and it connects the underworld. There's that hole in the base of it where Dambala the snake is usually kept. Then the tree of life, which is shamanic throughout the world, going up and connecting the bottom worlds to the top world. Another Haitian temple. Again, to me, these are indoor yard shows that sometimes manifest outdoors like this one. And how does that refer now? Because the Haiti that a lot of those earlier ones are is disappearing. In the poorest part of Port-au-Prince, after the earthquake, this group rose up. And all these guys were probably under 30 years old. And they took all the stuff of the wreckage of the storms and the earthquake and began to make these environments and these outside sculptures that related to their anger and frustration at what Haiti had become, and the fact that it was, well, Puerto Rico is sort of in that role right now, and as is St. Martin and a couple of the other islands, when you rebuild. And so all these things were very spiritual in nature, but all made from the detritus of and leftovers. And it's weird, you won't see it, so I don't know that. Yeah, I do have it in this one. There's a lot of real skulls because all the cemeteries blew up in Haiti, basically, and they use a lot of bones and skulls, which means absolutely that this isn't like this is going to be part of a commercial renaissance. This is André Eugene, who was one of the first people to really begin doing it, and then all these younger guys saw what he's doing, and each began to develop their own styles until there's like a whole neighborhood in Port-au-Prince now that's filled with this work. It's tough stuff. This is Everett Brown in Jamaica, who lived on top of a limestone mountain and basically painted all the stones in that mountain with codes and with depictions of the cosmogram. This is Leonard Daly, who painted his home indoors and out as a sort of daily journal of the things that he was going through. This is the outside of his house. This man has this is a portrait of his father. He's a ceramist. He can't understand why the middle and upper class Jamaicans don't buy his work for their homes. He owns a gardening center where he sells these things, but none of the white Jamaicans ever buy them. And as he went on, he learned pottery from a woman named Malou, who learned it from an ex-slave, and it just goes back and back. So this has a real Ghana influence on it. But this is how his yard began to develop. He began to put them on posts with big biblical quotes and Rastafarian, though he's not a Rasta. And it's right outside the airport when you come in from Montego Bay, and your car just goes right by it. There's the classic one eye open, one eye closed, one eye sees within, one eye sees the cosmos without. This is Lloyd Atherton, who his father was a bush priest, a bush doctor, and he decided to follow in his father's path. His yard, when you walk in, this was hanging tree, and I said, "What is that?" He called it a scaredy crow. And I said, "Yeah, no kidding." But these are, in Jamaica, altars are called seals. And these seals are all over the yard, and each one is dedicated to a different healing power. Essentially, it's herbalism. After his father died, he began to, one of the slides that you see with pink in them are homage to his father that had just been painted a couple of days. When I got there, I got there just in time for his father, who was being buried in this purple candy chrome coffin, and there was a copy of the essay I'd written on him on top of the coffin, which just sort of blew me away. This was another portrait of his father. This was his father. His father was also a great carver who carved amulets. I'm almost done here. This was a piece by his father that became an ancestral shrine within the yard. This is his bongo table. The religion is called bongo. And this is, he has healing potions and herbs and amulets that he gives people that were on this table. And the wildlife does come in and take over after a while, and he just works in and among it. I put this in as a sort of sideline to show a universality. Here's this fan that, again, is that cycle of life that I showed you before. This was in his yard, and that's where this tiny place he lived in. This is one in northern Florida in a random yard, and this is one by Kevin Sampson in a sculpture. And Kevin's sculptures, too, I see as indoor shrines, indoor yard shows. We're back to Lloyd Atherton again here. So constantly changing, constantly being repainted. Now that, if anyone can tell me what that is, it's this little thing where he stores the sculptures that he carves. He basically carves and throws them in there, and if someone shows up, he'll pull them out of there. But they're not what the art is about. Okay, to me, this is the most complex yard show in Jamaica right now. This is Errol Mackenzie, and he calls his yard Black Moon Island. And here it's dedicated to the Black Moon goddess. And this has nothing to do with Jamaican religion. This is not Rasta, this is not revival, this is not spiritualist church, it's not Pentecost. That's the eye of the goddess in the ground there. And this is the house that he built when I first saw it. And then I came back a couple of years later, and he had torn most of it up and out, and he was completely reforming it again. This is the brain of the environment, the brain of the moon goddess. And so that's where it connects to the house. This is him, that's her brain, but that's, for some reason, to the left, that's her knee. So you can see this is abstracted. That's part of the head of the moon goddess. And then all these wooden sculptures inside the house are part of the actual cement structure of the house as well. This is the control room, as he calls it, inside her brain, where he sits and basically moves dials. He's had people shooting at him. I mean, people do not like him there. These paintings are hung all over the environment to catch bad spirits, digest them, and spit them out again as good energy. And this is the entire yard to the left of the house. And I don't have a pointer, but at the very top is the eye that we saw in the beginning. And then her body comes down. This thing is huge. This thing is maybe 1.5 times the size of this auditorium. And the walls are built up about 6 feet off the ground. We had to climb up a hill across it to try and get it. And her body smooths down. That's her knee. You can see the point of her knee that hits the building there on the right. And this environment is still there. There's people buy the paintings and people pick up some of the sculptures, but his environment until recently has never been written about, never been noticed. Thank you. I didn't read it.
When we consider the variety of art environments preserved, supported, and restored by the Kohler Foundation and collected and exhibited by the John Michael Kohler Art Center, we recognize that the guiding principle has always been to focus on artists of intense personal vision who create realms of meaning within which they live, create realms of meaning within which they lived and by which we others may benefit. While the great majority of these artists are self-taught vernacular creators, some, such as Mary Knoll and Stella Waitskin, were trained artists well aware of and participating in the dominant art world of their time. Waitskin, in particular, was active in the downtown New York art scene of the 1960s as an artist involved in feminist performance and film, as well as developing her primary medium, sculpture, which she exhibited internationally over the course of her career. The exhibit of her work here at the Art Center invokes her Chelsea Hotel environment and spurs me to do two things today. in my talk. One is to speak about Stella, whom I knew for 15 years and on whose trust I serve. But I also want to address the challenge of this session, to transgress the unconvincing boundaries that have been drawn between art produced by artists participating in the so-called mainframe art world and those independent, often self-taught artists whose work emerged from the many sectors of the culture ignored or rejected as not being significant to art historical discourse. Now, to start, let's consider the phenomenon of the artist's constructed environment, as seen in the work of both those of the mainstream academic art world and those outside it. I argue that on the most basic level, there is no essential difference between them. I believe that we can productively compare the work of academically trained artists who created their works within the tradition and markets of mainstream art, such as Christo and Jean-Claude, Jessica Stockholder, Stella Waitskin, Mary Knoll. We can compare them with the creations of vernacular artists such as Joe Minter, Z.B. Armstrong, Lonnie Holley, Donnie Young, even Tyree Guyton, who did seek out training. For among them, these artists illuminate shared as well as distinctive patterns of visual configurations of objects and environments that reveal how individuals of both realms create meaning from their intense sense of visual experience in a manner that can communicate life truths to others who may or may not share the social and psychological place of origin. I start at the most basic, even the most obvious level of aesthetic experience, art as visual intelligence. As Rudolf Arnheim has stated, vision is a creative activity of the human mind. Perceiving accomplishes on the sensory level what in the realm of reasoning is known as understanding. Eyesight is insight. Visual intelligence apprehends significant structural patterns and dynamic forces in the surrounding world, and from them constructs a conception of reality that reveals the individual's psychological and cognitive responses to them. In the process, aesthetic intelligence readily draws as well from a wide range of life experiences, cultural concepts, and collective imagery to elaborate upon them metaphorically in the artwork. The artwork, that organized perceptual object by which the creator and the viewer experience an enactment of heightened perception, cognition, and emotional fullness. Artist-constructed environments are the creations of individual artists, trained or self-taught, who do what all artists do. They shape objects and three-dimensional space into statements of visual power, resonance, and often beauty. They create visual objects that bear significant meaning to testify to both the individual's intensely felt life and cultural placement, and they inform and enhance the viewer's experience. Now here at the Kohler Arts Center, the artist in constructed environment usually emphasizes the lived within space, but I'd like to touch upon, or at least address, a larger artist-shaped space as well. When we encounter or enter into artist-constructed environments, that is, when we're not just looking at, but are within the world, this sense of embodiment of visual meaning as our surround has a special power. It speaks of the intense personal drama of being in the world, of making meaning, of conceptualizing and framing a world, of transforming a private or public space into a site dense with personal, cultural, and aesthetic meaning, the forms which are not necessarily determined by being part of official or unofficial culture. For instance, the works of Christo and Jean-Claude, Stockholder, Tyree Guyton, and Joe Minter in their own ways address the general public, commanding an engaged response that's at once aesthetic, physical, and cultural, and explicitly political, while those of Waitskin, Armstrong, Holley, Donnie Young bespeak an essentially private, even obsessional vision, and only secondarily were open to the gaze of selected or accidental viewers. Yet their works can resonate with deeply felt personal and collective awareness. Common aesthetic impulses may reflect distinctive lifestyles, life visions. Consider the yard construction of the Southern African-American vernacular artist Dinah Young and this early backyard creation of Jessica Stockholder, who would go on to significant academic art world success. Here, both artists draw upon immediately available materials to structure and bring color to an outbuilding in their private backyards to highlight and transform their immediate, previously mundane environment. Both artists continued by further commanding greater space, enlarging their personal presence in the world around them. Dinah Young, for example, for her, this meant moving further and further into her rural yard and ultimately into the forest at the edge, dressing the spaces with natural materials found there, then repositioned and then repurposed to enigmatic personal use. Note, if you can, the pile of bricks positioned under the fallen and repositioned tree. This is a fallen tree, but you go into the woods, and somehow she's lifted the tree off the ground. She's placed a structure of bricks under it, sustaining the position of the tree. This is all the branches and trees shapes that she's taken on the left thing to create this structure around a tree. That is, these are perhaps ignorant uses. Now, return to this. Stockholder, embracing the formalist vocabularies of modern art, took the aesthetic first into large spaces to challenge public spatial vision and movement, and then into the urban environment, creating art environments out of cityscapes. Now, certainly there's a great difference between the personal worldviews of these artists and their viewers. Much of Young's intentions may not seem readily accessible to the outsiders who walk her land, except perhaps for those who share the visual language arising from the rural African-American yard show. Yet we might also wonder about the varying responses of Stockholder's unwitting audience, not attuned to the premises of site-specific installations, even if they've been long immersed in the patterns of commercial graphic designs. Given that the creative act for the artist is often one of simultaneous self-discovery and self-assertion, we often observe that the steadily intensification of personal expression in the increasing density of public mission and increasing density and expansion of enacted space, moving from an immediately personal into a larger public frame. Yet at the same time, we may speculate upon the challenges and affirmations the artist might feel when their work meets audiences from beyond their initial home ground. Taking Lonnie Holley, I have two signs of two environments that Lonnie Holley created. This can be seen in the artists from all quarters, within and beyond the certified art world. For instance, Lonnie Holley initially created an immensely dense environment in his immediate backyard and the thick woods around it, a space into which few people would venture. And when they did, they discovered striking constructions, all of which had stories to tell them, which Holley would then readily articulate. But when given a chance to bring his work to the larger public, indeed to the art world establishment, he did so equally readily, as seen in, if you could, his installation in the Birmingham Museum of Art. He was asked by the Birmingham Museum of Art to construct an environment in their open concrete yard for the space of some 8 months. And he did this with many, many pieces of found materials and objects that created a space, speaking of technological communication forms and the problems they created. And I asked, could we claim that one environment or creation was more meaningful and qualitatively different from the other? Both his works were intended to speak and to tell story and to mean something. First, in an environment that very few people would see, few would be lucky to walk through or understand, and others was made for the public. His mission didn't change. Joe Minter, on the other hand, began with a public mission, deciding to erect visual testaments to his people's and his nation's cultural and political history in his Birmingham, Alabama yard. But then, asserting his role as artist as griot, he steadily expanded the range and frequency of his statements beyond his yard into the neighborhood, reclaiming abandoned lots and buildings, creating his African village in America. Here, personal environment assumes from the start public meaning. while concurrently in Detroit, Tyree Guyton takes a collapsing neighborhood of abandoned lots and derelict homes, appropriating it by personal act when he and his family began clearing the area, turning its refuge into an art environment of hanging bunch sculpture, much like an extensive yard show, and then painting several abandoned buildings in what appear to be art school-inspired polka dot patterns and numerical abstractions. Guyton's transformations made a deteriorating environment dramatically visible, and in the process helped drive out ensconced drug dealers, enraged city bureaucrats who had ignored the city's area's plight and blight, and made public art serve a distressed community. For Guyton, as a youth, wanted to be an artist and received college training, the aesthetic almost immediately became political, his personal vision proclaiming public attention. For the young artist Christo, trained in and rebelling against the art school socialist realism aesthetic of the communist-era Bulgaria from which he had fled, art could be both an expression of intensely personal vision and yet embrace an extremely large and culturally diverse populace, most of whom had no expectations of becoming a participant audience. Christo's aesthetic is self-consciously modern, a combination of minimalist abstraction and new realism commercial materiality. His passion for art speaks directly to the most basic of aesthetic impulses, to enable us to experience the known world differently and more intensely than we normally do, and to expand our sense of being by presenting us with something we've never experienced before. For instance, draw a curtain and close up or continue the lines of a mountain range and allows people to drive through them. Construct hundreds of brightly flowing curtained gateways in a central park for thousands of people to walk through. Or create pathways across an Italian lake to let people, many people, walk or water. But let's go inside. Let's go inside now. Not all art environments are constructed for in the outside world, no pun intended. Many, more than we'll ever know, are built within, behind closed doors. They are private, sometimes open only to the invited or an unexpected viewer. Yet they can be every bit as aesthetically shaped, symbolically resonant, and existentially significant as any externally created art environment. Admittedly, these interior spaces are especially resonant of the animating spirit, the struggles and the visionary qualities of the artist, because they are lived within as much as they become an externalization of that which is within the artist. Here are glimpses of two. The walls of Z.B. Armstrong's modest Alabama home were covered by as many hand-drawn and handmade calendars. They have been identified by some as his doomsday clocks, expressions of his fixation on the passing of time and the impending end that awaited him and us all. The calendars and clocks once created accumulated, and they were used. Holes punched in the cardboard faces allowed inserted nails to be moved day by day. No winding necessary. The place was extremely quiet, but time did move on. The Chelsea environment that Stella Waitskin created during her 30-year residence also had many clocks. These cast polyester resin sculptures were emblems of mortality, having emerged in the early 1980s after the untimely death of her youngest son, and the artist grew increasingly reclusive within her densely filled environment, her apartment. Indeed, in her later years, fewer and fewer people would be invited into the space. When we explore Waitskin's environment, I believe we can observe signs of a creative passion, even necessity, that led to the development of such a dense enwrapping space, a pattern of creation common, I suggest, to other environment creators. An idea, a theme, an image most certainly announces itself, is established, and then explored again and again. The image, laden with personal meaning, multiplies and provokes other thoughts, themes, and visual statements, giving voice to, and indeed nourishing, the artist's creative self and the extension into the world around her. For Stella Waitskin, this expansion was directly connected to her artistic process as a sculptor. She would find an object, very frequently an old leather-bound book, and make a mold from it, and then would mix polyester resin in the mold. And working rather quickly before the resin completely set up, she'd float pigments, sometimes objects in the resin, creating multi-hued works. Although each work began from a particular mold and could be viewed as a discrete place, Stella would rarely be content to let it be that. She'd use the mold again and again, creating series of works, each one different with respect to the particular hue or the density, the degree of translucence or opacity she sought. These works might be presented alone or in a group. But then she might also stack book upon book and conjoin them horizontally to create compact sculptures, often quite formally constructed. At still other times, a book would be abutted to a book, and soon a shelf would be created. Then shelf would be added to shelf, and soon a library would be created. Then shelf upon shelf would take over a wall and create formidable works such as Details of a Lost Library. And ultimately, wall would join wall, and an art environment would be constructed. In many of her works, the form of the book established itself as a primary statement and served as a foundation into or onto which other cast resin images, such as a face, birds, fruit, would be placed. The book as object and as concept was especially important to Waitskin and proved an extremely resonant form and theme. It's a transmitter of human thought and feeling across time and among peoples. Waitskin found in it a direct personal link to her great-grandfather, a Jewish scholar from Eastern Europe, and she encouraged her own son Fred in his life as a writer of books. Yet when I pick up a book of hers, I may sense its individual wisdom and cultural spirit, but I cannot read it. The book, it doesn't open. It doesn't have words. Now, of course, all visual works of art are silent. Art, as a visual experience, does not need words. But Stella Waitskin's impenetrable books impose a heavy silence upon us, even as they are resonant with feeling and I believe, life wisdom that evokes the greater silences being within and beyond us. If the books were silent and closed, nonetheless, they, like her other artworks, are powerfully communicative, both spiritually and emotionally affecting. There's an overwhelming aura of mystery about them, yet they assert an intense, immediate physicality. Her use of leather-bound books for her molds calls up a distant past, just as her cast female faces resemble cameos of another era. But we feel most immediately the embodied passion of the artist's life, her deep understanding of human longing and loss, of personal desire and achievement. Even if most of the books are silent and closed, it's remarkable how frequently something quite different, quite human emerges from them, the human face. Contemporaneous with her taking up of the book as the image in the early 1970s, Stella began making molds of faces, almost entirely molds from other sculpted objects, sometimes real people. These books seem to speak, or rather the books seem ready to speak, but they remain as silent as others in Stella's libraries. The faces almost never have opened eyes and only rarely look directly at us. The figures are as closed, as interior-looking as are the books, even the open books from whom faces emerge. Nonetheless, the human presence is affirmed in these works, haunted and haunting, even more so in her Holocaust works. Note the faces entombed within these black and blackened works. They are not that distant in mood from the faces trapped inside the numerous clocks that Stella created following the death of her son Billy in 1983. Here, time has stopped, the face of the clock replaced by the human face, human presence within. And for sheer poignancy, Stella would call upon another icon of suffering. There are depths of emotion in Stella Waitskin art that are rarely made evident in mainstream art of our time, though she always considered herself a participant in the mainstream art world. Nonetheless, she would rarely reveal those depths directly to others, and often adopted a theatrical, even fictive persona, instead finding space apart within her constructed environment and drew upon powerful inner resources to create works of immense beauty and emotional resonance, that we might recognize what might lie well within our own selves, our own souls. Thank you.